So it's an honor to have Dr. Jordan Daniel Wood on the podcast to discuss his new book, The Whole Mystery of Christ. Jordan, thank you for your time and writing.
Thank you for having me, Henry. It's a pleasure.
Your new book is an exposition of the works of St. Maximus the Confessor, a Byzantine monk and theologian active during the 7th century AD. He participated in some theological controversy and was tortured, finally dying in exile. After his death, his honor was restored and he was recognized as a saint. What initially drew you to Maximus?
To be honest, the initial draw was that I needed a credit to fill my Greek patristics course. When I first showed up to Boston College, I had gone there to study with Father Khalid Anatolios, but that was actually the time when he was transitioning to Notre Dame, and it wasn't yet public. So I show up there basically planning on staying in the 4th century, probably writing on Gregory of Nyssa. Though, that's all hazy. And so I was like looking around because I needed to take a class, and I saw that this course was being offered on Maximus by Father Maximus Constus, the translator of the Ambigua into English and the Questions to Thalassius. So I took a whole course on the Ambigua the first semester I showed up to Boston, and pretty much 3 weeks into that semester, reading Maximus, especially Ambiguum 7 in particular, I had decided I was going to be spending a lot of time with this guy. So,
And what was your experience like at Boston College in general?
Oh, in general, it was interesting because Boston College, Greek patristics in particular, at that time in particular, where it was sort of going through a transition phase a little.
This would be 1998?
No. This is I got there 2014. I thought you were serious. Yeah, it was back in the 90s. But no, so I was like, anyway, it was good. It was in general, but it was sort of for me in particular, it was a patchwork. I had to figure out external readers. I had to put together classes from other institutions, not just Boston College. So, yeah. It was a good time.
And why did you write this book?
This book in particular. So there's a few different things here. We could go at it like exegetically, and autobiographically, this is what happened. I mean, I'm just reading the words on the page, and I'm trying to understand what they mean. And I had once upon a time an abiding interest in how the incarnation in particular relates to the creation, and but I had kind of thought I'd moved on from all that. I was like, okay, I was interested in the controversies around Analogia Entis and Balthazar and Barchvar and all that stuff. But I was kind of done with it. But then when I was reading Maximus and he's making certain claims that I focus on in the book, for example, the book's main epigraph that the Word of God, very God, wills always and in all things to actualize the mystery of his incarnation. I was like, wow, that's ornate, right? That's a kind of bold claim to make. I wonder how serious he really is about that. I mean, it's one thing to speak about the presence of God in all things, omnipresence, that everything is a kind of theophany, a participation in the one or in God. All of that is there in different ways in Maximus. But to take somebody who was so precise to the point of death, torture and death over matters Christological, who is then willing to employ the same language, even the exact same terms about as you might say, the general God-world relation, that struck me as at least worth asking to what extent he really means to use those words. He doesn't seem to be careless with his terms and with his expressions very often. And what I sort of saw was that most commentators on Maximus, whether explicitly or just implicitly by assumption, didn't really seem to take those sorts of statements, you might say, literally or in the plain sense as they seem to mean on the page. So there's that, right? There's just a question, an exegetical question. What is he actually saying? Is it really what it sounds like he's saying? And what would that mean if it were? That's one foray into this stuff. Another one would be that I do think it's worth, the claim of the incarnation is that in the person of Christ, at least it's this, in the person of Christ, you have a sort of I don't know if unique's the right word, but a peculiar relation, even a relation of identity or oneness between cause and effect, creator and creature, God and the world, and that does and has over the first several hundred years and even today caused controversy, because it's not immediately clear to a lot of different people how that can be anything other than a contradiction to say those things. I know some are unsure about that approach, but it's hard for me to read the sources, whether in the patristic or the medieval era, and not see this concern over and over and over again. That is the concern particularly of how can you predicate of one and the same subject seemingly contrary or even contradictory predicates. And so that is interesting, because either it really does seem to be a kind of, you might say, some people would say it's a paradox, it's a mystery, or others will actually say, no, it's a contradiction, so they want to reject what they think is being conveyed by the incarnation. Or we might also choose to see, this is more what my book does, this third option, would be to say, well, in one sense, this is a new thing. St. Gregory of Nazianzus talked about the newness of the incarnation. St. Gregory of Nyssa talks about the new mode in which God is present in the incarnation. Maximus does the same, and he's usually commenting on them. Dionysius talks about the new theandric energy. He calls it new. Why is it new? Right? So there's something new there to discuss and to think about or think through or contemplate. But newness doesn't automatically mean opposition or contradiction, right? So maybe this is a new, deeper, more profound way of getting at the God-world relation, namely in that one, at least one case where the relation was himself, a relation of identity, where he is both creator and creature. So that's a more systematic approach to the question, and that is hovering and it animates the entire text as well. So we've got the exegetical, what does Maximus really mean? And we've got the sort of systematic or theoretical. Does the historical incarnation say anything about God's relation to the rest of history in the world? So those are two angles.
You mentioned different sources and also your studies at Boston College in Greek. When did you learn Greek? When you're reading all of this, are you reading it in the original language? What's your relation to the Greek language?
So I became Catholic about almost 8 years ago. My childhood tradition was in something called the Stone Campbell or Restoration tradition. We could talk more about that later if we want. But the one there's a lot of things, obviously, I became discontent with in that tradition. But one thing that I am appreciative of and a merit of that tradition is that very early on, they emphasize the Bible because there's nothing else. There's really nothing else as a part of this expression of Christianity. It's a kind of primitivist. Literally, it's called the Restoration Movement. They, once upon a time, they would say, "Let's restore the New Testament church," and then, of course, quickly you realize, like, the New Testament church isn't like, roses and candy and stuff. It's not Candyland or anything, but even more than normal mainline Protestant, a focus on the text, because they don't even have a mainline tradition. You got a few figures, but they're not like Luther's or Calvin's or Zwingli's or any of that. We don't have that. It's just you got the text. So there's a great emphasis on learning the languages. So at 18, as soon as I got out of high school, I took Greek courses already at 7 a.m. 4 days a week at a small Bible college.
Were these seminary Greek courses, or were you learning modern Greek? Or what were you learning?
They scarcely in that tradition even have seminary, but it's basically Bible college. Yes, essentially what you would recommend. I took 2 years of Hebrew. I took 3 years of Greek there. I took a semester of Aramaic. I sat in an Ugaritic and Akkadian. So because there's nothing else to study other than reading biblical commentaries from people in that tradition. So and trying to learn how to preach and run a church or whatever. So I began at 18 learning biblical Greek, which, as we know, isn't the same thing as like classical or Attic or even later Byzantine Greek. And so that I had to develop a little bit later in my graduate studies. I was more focusing on, I took an Attic course and so forth, reading Plato in the Greek. So I'm reading Maximus in the Greek. I'm actually I'm translating right now his 49 letters, which like only 2 or 3 of which have ever been translated into English. So I'm translating them into English. for the Fathers of the Church series, CUAP.
And when will that be published?
Oh, geez, probably 2 years out. I got a few other projects concurrent right now, and I'm also a stay-at-home dad, so I do it on the side.
So the preface and introduction to the whole mystery of Christ make clear that your project is not only to make more people aware of Maximus's writings, but also to propound your own particular interpretation of him and expound your own original ideas. Where does Maximus stop and Wood start?
Well, in one way, I would say that's almost in principle a question I can't answer. It's going to have to be the readers that do that, because look, it's me. If I tell you where I start and Maximus ends, it's me still. It's still me saying that. And so, how do you adjudicate that? So, in one way, I would say I can't. Now, as I say, I think in the preface somewhere, I don't think I was in these programs that call themselves historical theology. And there's all this contention about what does that even mean? How does it distinguish itself? It seems like it's kind of a weird hybrid. You do set yourself up for almost being just doing two things badly rather than one thing really well. So it's like, are you a historian? Are you a theologian? Are you trying to do both? And so you do kind of get flack from both sides because it looks like a category breaker. I happen to think that's probably just, in my opinion, historical theology, of which this book is a work, or an instance, is basically just what probably other people would recognize as doing theology in the history of the church. That is to say, nobody is just sitting there saying, well, here's something that occurred to me, without already having some kind of authorities in the form of scripture, of course, in the liturgy, and to prior commentators on scripture and the liturgy, prior theologians, philosophers, scientists, whatever it is, wherever it is you think that the divine truth can be accessed, you are going to pull that all together. And so historical theology, without getting into kind of boring details of like 20th century Catholic fights over Les Saucements or, a Nouvelle Théologie or any of that stuff, you can just understand it as kind of it's an intentional standing in the breach between otherwise divided disciplines. So I don't think I have a license, therefore, though, to mistreat the sources or to ignore the original languages or to do things that, historians would sort of want to be checking you on and verifying you on. Maximus, for example, was a monk. He wasn't a church leader. Which is kind of amazing if you think about it. I mean, he was so influential that the emperor still cared what he was saying at 80 years old about a topic, by the way, that had never even been dogmatically proclaimed. And the request made of Maximus was not that he was to admit he was wrong. The only thing they were asking him to do was to shut up. So it's like, you can hold whatever you want. You can say whatever you want about this two wills thing, but just stop writing about it, stop talking about it. But the problem is, and you see this in the very form of Maximus's works, all of his works, most of them are dialogical, right? They're question and answer. And it's because he actually got questions sent to him from all sorts of different people. Like I said, I'm translating the letters. If you look at all his correspondences, who they are, it's all over the place. There's some politicians, there's former abbots, there's former novices, there's so-and-so bishop, right? And they're all writing to him, and they're submitting questions to him. They so respected his mind, his intellect, and his holiness that they wanted his opinion, and his opinion carried such great weight that he was tortured for it. Not an official leader of the church in any capacity, as a lay monk. He's still tortured.
Why was he tortured?
Because he was teaching.
You said for his opinion, but what opinion?
Diatheletism, that Christ had two wills, a human will and a divine will. There had been several waves of controversy prior, but this was sort of one of the last ones. And he was insistent that we must confess that Christ has two wills, and because if you don't, you're not confessing he has two natures ultimately, was his argument. There's much more there, but that's...
His repression was fundamentally political in nature.
I don't know. It was at least political in nature, but the problem is there had already been other disputes between Maximus and other people, and there were no political consequences at all. So for him, it wasn't political only. There's also
No, I mean for his enemies or his people that were torturing him. They didn't really care what he thought. It was mostly, shut up because you're causing some kind of political
Yeah,
issue.
I think certainly from the very top, like say from the emperor's perspective, sure, no question. Now it gets a little more dicey though, because if you're thinking about say Bishop Theodosius, who is who you can read, or Pyrrhus, right? You can read the actual disputes, the account of their disputes. There are moments. It's hard to know exactly their motives. I mean, certainly it's easy to kind of say, well, they're just sort of carrying out the imperial agenda or whatever. And I'm not denying who wants to deny that completely. However, there are moments you can see in there where they almost seem genuinely curious about, well, hold on, what would you say about the Synod of whatever and for whatever? You know, like it's more than just trying to trap them. There is a sense, and in fact,
It's really not possible to divorce politics and theology in this time period.
right. And Bishop Pyrrhus actually does recant in his dispute with Maximus, so that wouldn't really be a shrewd political move. And yet later he comes back, right? So it's messy. It's messy. Yeah.
In the first chapter of your book, you discuss the mystery of the Incarnation. What do you think it means for that mystery to be actualized always and in all things?
Well, yeah, that's the whole book. I think
Specifically with the emphasis of the first chapter.
Yeah. Okay. So the mystery of Christ, or of the Incarnation, we'll say that's what I focus on there. So I think what it means is that there's different ways to approach this, but I'll say this. I think that unless an instance is not an instance of the word, to use Ariugena's way of putting it, and if it's not an instance of the divine word, the second person of the Trinity, bearing what seem to be an abstraction contrary predicates like impassible or passible, temporal and eternal. If it's the case that there is no one single subject bearing both of those predicates at once, then I don't know why we would call it an incarnation, right? Incarnation, like for example, incorporeal and corporeal, from like carnis, incarnation, in the body. If it's one thing to say with, like, say, I'll just choose one because I've been I've been criticized for this by some people that are very pro Neoplatonist, but I'll just say Iamblichus in the first book on the Mysteries, where he's defending theurgy, the concept of theurgy, and he's doing so with Plotinian ideas against a student of Plotinus, Porphyry. And against the idea that maybe we can return and reunite ourselves with the one by basically sort of going into our own soul and contemplating what is there in such a way that is like a bodiless, almost like kind of a kind of escape or a turning away from the external. Iamblichus wants to emphasize the external, because then you see the importance of the mediation through ritual, through certain sort of orders of incantations, through the temples of the gods, etc. Right, and so he's trying to make this argument, but so there he has every interest in trying to bring together what you might call the highest cause, like on the vertical scale, if you want to put it that way. It's a little crude, but just for an image, with the lowest things like matter. My point is, he has an interest in doing that. But even there, one of the things he explicitly says is he does not think that his case means that, for example, the gods themselves can be given predicates which are proper only to their effects. So the god is not circumscribed by a time and place just because you go to a certain time and place in order to participate in theurgy, like this temple over there with this priest, etc. And yet, of course, that is the mediation to the gods. And so there's a sense in which there's a relation of the gods to that time and place. So you need to go there. Otherwise, his case is lost. But he wants to emphasize what I would call an asymmetrical relation. That just because you have to go there and you have to do these things with these materials, and that affects your union with the god whose temple this is, doesn't mean that god is therefore circumscribed by the media that you had to use to get to him. It's asymmetrical. It's not reciprocal or symmetrical. That, I think, is fine and actually makes a ton of sense. It's coherent. But that just can't be what we mean in the Incarnation, simply. What we mean in the Incarnation is that the Son of God, who is with the Father and the Spirit, the cause of all things, also becomes an effect of that cause. So that what happens to Jesus of Nazareth does happen to the Son of God, since they are one and the same subject. That's a bridge too far, I think, for a lot of people. And I think so. So now the question becomes, once again, like I said earlier, is this just sheer nonsense? Is this just contradiction? Or is this, or is there a way to kind of, sort of rearrange things in such a way that it's not, you're still getting at some of what the incarnation is trying to affirm, but you don't want to fall into logical traps. And so you have all these different options throughout all the patristic era. Do we do Apollinarius's way, which actually made a ton of sense? Do we do Arius's way, which had its own kind of inner coherence? Do we do Nestorius's way? Well, what about later attempts to kind of mediate this, like through Cyril onto Severus and the Miaphysites? That was one way, right? Or we can go towards strict Chalcedonians who said, well, we got the Chalcedonian definition. We're just simply not going to go beyond it, or whatever. There's a lot of different ways. And there were a lot of other people who just said, stop talking altogether. That happened several different times in the patristic era. And so this is kind of the question. I mean, if this is a new, as we said earlier, in any sense, a new affirmation, I think that's where I would start to locate it. It has to be that the Son is somehow the subject of both sets of contrary predicates. Now, I don't think that necessarily means you begin with general abstract predicates and then you say, oh, here's a problem. There is no problem from most Neoplatonic perspectives here, because there's no one subject that you have to say that about. Right? So there's no tension. There's no pressure. There's no problem of this for a lot of different world religions, because there's no one subject that you're saying this about. There's a neat sort of hierarchy, and this predicate applies to this in this way, and this a predicate which seems contrary to this one, like temporality or mortality or whatever, corruptibility. This applies to lower levels, to different subjects on a different level, right? So there's no problem there. There is a problem, though, whenever you say, behold the man, and what you're saying here is that this one who is man, ecce homo, is also God, through whom all things were created. That starts to introduce problems. And so I think that is an engine of the controversy over this for several centuries, and I would submit that it's still an engine of maybe not controversy, but spurring to further reflection about the meaning of this mystery today even. So that's why I say all that, is because a lot of the first chapter of the book, I try to trace in sort of detail how the so-called Neo-Chalcedonians, that's just a scholarly label that says people post-Chalcedon who were trying to defend Chalcedon's teaching about Christ, about the two natures in one person, but they were trying to do it in a way that explained why the council was not Nestorian. Because if you look at the Chalcedonian definition, it looks like a lot of pairs, like dualisms, right? I mean, there's the singular emphasis, the one Lord Jesus Christ at the beginning, and the one person at the end. The one person hypostasis at the end. But everything in the middle is two. This one was born of the Father before all ages, was also born in these last ages of the Virgin Mary. This one is consubstantial with the Father and the Spirit, and is also consubstantial with us, humanity. This one is perfect God, fully complete in his nature as God, fully complete in his nature as human. So someone like Severus of Antioch, the main anti-Chalcedonian thinker, the champion of the Miaphysites, and in a lot of traditions considered a saint, he's looking at this, and others that are sympathetic with his side, and saying, look, this sounds nice, but to be honest with you, it basically looks like Nestorius, but like 2.0 here, because we're multiplying dualities in Christ. It's as if Christ is divided straight down the middle. And then the further controversies make it worse, right? Two natures, two activities, two wills, two minds? What's going on, right? That's why Gethsemane becomes such a huge point of contention, because there you seem to have Christ struggling with this event to come, asking the Father to remove it. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And so Miaphysites would say, look, if you're saying there's two wills here, that's a battle of wills. There's a division. There's a fundamental division that you're even introducing into the heart of God. which cannot be. So what Neo-Chalcedonians needed to do was explain Chalcedon in such a way that it assuaged those who were in the line of Cyril, Saint Cyril, whose emphasis is almost always on the unitive subject, the one subject bearing of the Gospels, bearing these predicates, if you want to put it abstractly, or just say he's the one subject of the Gospel, who both doesn't know the hour or the time, but also can read people's thoughts, who both, walks on water and says he knows God and was here before, and he knows he was in the bosom of the Father, and also is crucified and suffers. Right? So for Cyril, you begin with the oneness, the subject, and whatever else you try to go on to say about the duality is almost secondary. Because if you start with duality in Cyril's perspective, you'll never get around to getting to one, which I think he has a point there. So he says, for example, at the end of one of his letters, I think letter 45, he says he speaks against those who, quote, speak with undue precision. They speak with undue precision about the sufferings of the Lord, as if he were two. Right? So that's his concern. He's less concerned in working out all the details about how the two-ness works in relation to the one. He just wants to defend the oneness, and I think a lot of Miaphysites do too. And they're trying to be faithful to him in that way. So Neo-Chalcedonians have to explain to the Miaphysites why it is that Chalcedon didn't simply betray Cyril in his emphasis on the oneness. So in order to do that, they have to develop what it means to be an hypostasis as distinct from ousia. So there has to be conceptual refinements or developments, or else you're just stuck with the formula, which seems on its face like absurd. So that's a lot of the first chapter of my book tries to get at this new way that the incarnation is even possible in the face of its actuality, is on the level of hypostasis, which has its own logic. I call it like a hypostatic logic, or the logic of person, as distinct from a logic of nature or essence. And what you end up getting is that what seems to be on the level of essence, abstract and contradictory, is not always. In fact, often we have other cases, including our own selves, where on the level of person, they are not contradictory. In fact, they're synthesized, to use Constantinople II's language. They're synthesized as the person, him or herself. One example, and then I'll stop on this. One example is that they like to use, which Miaphysites also like to use it for a different reason, is the unification of body and soul in one person, a human person. If you think about soul and body, according to their essence, their ousia, they are contrary. They're not contradictory, but they are contrary. Soul is not spatial in the way that body is spatial and locative, right? Soul is not visible physically in the way that body is. And so there are some contraries here. Origen already pointed this out in On First Principles too. But nevertheless, not only are they one in the person, say in you, Henry, or in me, hypostasis, you yourself are their oneness. It's not just that, but they are not even different from each other in reality unless they are you. Because after all, your body and your soul didn't exist prior to being yours. They are yours. And so you are your body and your soul, and in you they even differ in fact, not just in essence, like abstractly. They differ in fact, as they are also united in fact in your person. If we were simply thinking according to the logic of essences, that wouldn't be possible. It shouldn't be possible. And yet you yourself are your own greatest proof that it is in fact possible. And so there must be another, as it were, dimension to reality, the level of hypostasis, where those things are not only actual, but in fact, they're the condition for the possibility of you to abstract about the essences at all and how they differ and how they relate. So all of this to say, to bring it to a close in this first chapter, developments like that, what they'll say about the body-soul comparison is like the same thing exactly holds in the person of Christ. It's just that the natures that differ there are seemingly absolutely contrary. right? Body and soul at least share one thing in common, namely that they are temporal. Like they're created at a certain time. Maximus is really clear on that at the end of Big Game 7. But again, abstractly, I'm not talking yet about the reality of divinity, how it actually is, or the reality of humanity, how it actually is, but abstractly. You can't make those come together in an abstract way. There must be a more determinate reality which makes them one. That is the person of Christ, just like your person makes your body and soul one, and even differ at all within you, right? So that's the kind of comparison, the kind of developments that they have to do, and it gets really weird and sophisticated, and it opens up a lot of questions. I don't deny it, but that's the sort of work they're doing in order to meet the Miaphysite demand that the oneness be preserved and in fact foregrounded amidst all the Chalcedon's dualities. So I think that's an incarnation, is getting there where that person, on the level of person, not only bears to abstract sets of contraries, but in fact makes them really possible, and even their difference possible at all.
So you mentioned a few different logics, and one of the logics in the first chapter that you bring up is what you call Christologic, and you contrast it with what you call mere Christocentrism. What is the difference between those things?
Yeah, so a note on the word logic, the way I'm using it there. It really just comes from, right, as we know, logos or logi, and that's important in Maximus because he has that famous doctrine of the logi. He also has, by the way, and some people this is something I think Henry and I can agree pretty strongly on. Sometimes people get the idea that the church fathers were like somehow not intellectual, or they didn't care about like philosophical precision or logical rigor because holiness kind of does all the work or something. Well, it's kind of important to note that circulating among Maximus's papers and manuscripts were some people think even Maximus authored these, but were brief commentaries and even charts on Porphyry's tree in the categories. There were Sicilian categories. Because someone, in the words of one scholar, either Maximus himself thought you needed to know these things to even understand what he's saying most of the time, or someone thought you needed this basic instruction.
What was Maximus's training?
It's obscure because we don't even there's not even agreement about where he was born, where he was raised. So
I've heard it said that he wasn't very advanced in rhetoric.
Yeah, well, he says that about himself, and you always wonder about to what extent. I will say, translating as Greek, I'm no authority on Greek literature generally, but like it's some of those sentences are very convoluted and difficult. So I'm not sure if I would judge that as a great rhetorician. But yeah. So anyway, logos. When I say logic, I'm sort of deriving from this idea of the kind of intelligible structures of the realities you contemplate. And there is a structure to an essence. There is a structure to the way the essence differs from accidents. There's a structure to the way that, what the implications are for, certain sorts of qualities as they interact with other sorts of quantities, etc. Right? So this is what I mean by logic. In one way, I'm just sort of deriving it from the Greek words often being used by Maximus himself when he's talking about him. He has, like, in these lists of definitions, the logos of ousia is X. The logos of hypostasis is X, right? Is Y. I mean, so that's more or less just bringing it and transliterating it or whatever into English. There is also, of course, the philosophical background that I later came to appreciate and was somewhat accidental about, the importance of writing logics and, say, idealism. But I think the most immediate cause for me to say that and make that distinction between Christologic and Christocentrism is that there's a lot of talk about Christocentrism, both, especially in the 20th century theology, right? If someone's theology or thought is Christocentric, it basically just, a lot of the work being done there is like an image, right? You think of a circle, you got Jesus in the middle. He's like the bullseye of the target. and you just sort of like shoot around, but he's the target or something. Or you might, something more kinetic, you might say like, He's like the centrifugal force. He's like the middle. Everything starts swirling around it. And I just think that's imprecise. I think like hardly anyone would deny that Jesus is like important in Christian thinking of any kind. Thomas Aquinas, the Thomists will constantly say, look, it's not that Thomas doesn't think Jesus is important, right? Just because he doesn't get to Christology proper until the third part of the Summa doesn't mean he doesn't begin with Christ, doesn't mean he's not Christocentric. So I just came to think that term Christocentric, and there are some works written even specifically on Maximus that use this phrase Christocentric. I just think it's too imprecise. It's too imprecise to match Maximus's actual what he's actually saying, right? And it kind of dovetails into what we were just talking about, that Christocentrism just gives you an image that says Christ is really important. He's the center of gravity. Everything kind of in some way or another relates to him. I think Christologic means, well, who exactly is Christ? What exactly is the quote unquote structure of the incarnation? How does it relate to any other just good old transcendent, immanent relation between God and the world that almost anyone has wholly apart from Christ? And does that matter at all? Is there anything distinctive about it whatsoever? And it's interesting because, and some people have sort of associated with me with Barth or Barthian readings of Maximus and so forth. All I can say autobiographically is that, sure, Barth was important for me at a certain point. But by the time I got to Maximus, he was pretty far from my mind. And I thought I kind of was done with all that. I had become Catholic. I thought, you know what, I'm just going to do the natural theology thing. That's what we do. So I didn't have any intention of trying to harmonize the two. But one thing I will point out is that I think Maximus gets, and this is a claim that I perhaps can't substantiate here, but I think Maximus gets what Barth wants, but he does it with so much more precision. And he does it with the entire rigor of the patristic Christological developments. And the reason that that's important is exactly that the distinction between Christologic and Christocentrism. It's not just that you have to quote a verse about Jesus at some point and make your disquisition important and Christocentric. It's that there's an act, what's revealed in the one who is through whom all things were made, when that one was made, is the very structure of the world. The logic of creation, the logic of the cosmos, right? And so it's not just that you find out Christ is central to the cosmos, like he's very important or the pinnacle or something. You find out that he is the condition for the very possibility of creation. So we're getting at something deeper there than just that you have to stamp Jesus's name on your text at some point in big, red letters. So that's the kind of distinction I'm working with there.
Another logic that you bring up in the first chapter is cosmologic. What's the relation between Christologic and cosmologic?
Yeah, it's probably a more economical way of saying what I was just saying, which is that the cosmologic, what I mean by that is both the structure of the emergence of the cosmos, so creation from nothing, but also the kind of, as I use in the book, right, the middle. It's the beginning and the middle and the end. It's the whole of the cosmos, like the project, as Father Bear would say, the project of creation or of creating a human being. And so the cosmologic, I initially distinguished that from Christologic only in order to then identify them ultimately, right? And say the logic of Christ, if you put it that way, in a terse way, is nothing but the logic of the entire world, so that the two bear the same distinctive marks in their very conditions and actuality. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but.
Oh, I understand what you're saying. You've mentioned several times the need for precision, and you also criticize the, quote, misstep of those who, quote, flee to Cappadocian Trinitarian terminology for uncritical succor. Why is criticism of Nicene language warranted?
Well, it's not a criticism of Nicene language. It's a criticism of making Nicaea the end when it really is the beginning. So, and here's...
Well, then why do you say flee to Cappadocian terminology?
Well, because...
what's the criticism of the terminology per se?
Yeah, the criticism is that that the controversies that the Cappadocians were engaged in, mostly against Eunomius, were not designed to meet the later demands of Christological controversy, just by the fact that they're separated by hundreds of years. And yet they are the tradition that Maximus has to comment on, that Maximus believes is authoritative. And so they have to be, and that Chalcedon, by the way, still is claiming, even though it's also introducing other texts like Leo's Tome, which, again, someone like Severus would say is basically just Nestorian through and through. So the criticism, there's a few sort of people I have in mind there, but I do think there's a kind of general sentiment, if I could put it this way, that if we just go back to 4th century Trinitarian Cappadocian theology as a kind of baseline or a least common denominator, this will be ecumenically useful. This will help resolve questions that are too knotty and too difficult to address in any other way. We need to kind of get back to the basics. I think that's basically just reinventing the wheel, though, because and I think, by the way, there's a book that's really important on this that just came out somewhat recently, Johannes Zachhuber's book. I think the title is The End of Ancient Philosophy and the Rise of Christian Theology, or something like that. And he pretty meticulously chronicles the developments that I'm only alluding to here, where he says, for example, the Cappadocian quote-unquote classical theory of hypostasis and ousia, which does work fairly well in Trinitarian theology. He notes different dimensions, though, that they're not worked out in their inherent tensions. He calls it the so-called abstract interpretation of their view, or the concrete. And here's what he means. As long as you just keep it on the level of abstraction and you say something like this, well, there's 3 persons in God. That just means there's 3, modes is one word that were used, with qualification, of course, after Sibelius, but you get you got 3 sort of subjects or something like subjects. Now their action and the power of their action is one. That's Gregor of Nyssa ad Oblabium. But their roles are distinct. And even in the Cappadocians, it's pretty clear that the roles in the one act of God are distinct. The Father is not incarnate, right? The Father, it's not through the Father that all things are made. It's by, quote, usually they say by the will of the Father and the it's like a weird phrase. It's like a self-execution or actualization in the Word, the Son, and the completion or perfection by the Spirit. It's not 3 separate acts, right? But it's 3 roles in one act. So that's fine, and that works pretty well when you're just thinking about Trinitarian theology more or less after Nicaea, right? Where you've got now the Son and Spirit later, at least after Constantinople. They're all consubstantial, and you're trying to work out what that means. So you get the famous definition, like from St. Basil, that ousia stands to hypostasis as the common does to the particular. Now, of course, you got to still go on and make qualifications, because you don't mean that divinity is a genus. That would be bad, because then you have tritheism in his mind, right? And in the Cappadocians' opinion. But also, you don't want to say that what's common is a genus, but you also then don't want to say that the particulars are merely particulars, like individuals. And yet, if you keep it at the abstract level, it works. It works because you at least get that point. You get the relation. All right, sure. There's one God because there's only one essence that's called divine, ousia. That's sort of there's only one Father. Sure. Although, the problem will become that Father can be used equivocal too. Father is the Father of creation. Does that mean the same thing as the Father of the Son? That was actually part of Arius' concern. He was okay with saying, look, yes, God is Father, insofar as he's the cause of all things. But you don't want to say God actually has a Son that is somehow analogous to you having a son, so that now there are two humans, or in that case, 2 gods. Right? So he wants to make a clear equation between being begotten, and then Eunomius speaks of being begotten and being made. Because if God is Father, and the one Father, and he's Father of all, then there's no distinction in saying he has a son and then that son is just a creature. Right? Because and so what has to happen is you have to come along and say with Nicaea and Constantinople and the Cappadocians, well, being begotten and being made are not the same. Well, okay, well then what about the word Father? Because that means there's two uses of that now, right? There's a proper father relation, paternal relation, and then there's the secondary one of the father to the creation, right? So this gets complicated. But in the letter I have in mind in particular, Basil doesn't really make a point at all about the Father. He just says that the divinity is common. The ousia is common, which is what makes it one God, and then the hypostases are like particulars, which makes them distinct in some way, which you need because of the distinct roles. And so the point that Zachhuber is making here, and you can probably already sense this in what we're saying, is that this just simply is insufficient. It's not that it's wrong. It's not that it's wrong or didn't have a use or wasn't important for the moment. Of course it was. This is all occasional, right? It's in the face of Eunomius that they're saying these things. It's that it will later be found to be insufficient. And the very obvious proof of this is that Severus is just as much a Cappadocian promoter and quoter as Leontius of Byzantium was. And yet they completely disagree about the meaning of Christ and the incarnation, right? Well, I don't know, completely is too overstated, but they disagree in important ways, right? And so it can't be that. So my general point with that statement that you quoted is that if we just simply think, in principle, if we just go back to the 4th century and we recover the uses of the terms that we find there, this is just doing nothing but setting the stage for yet another portrayal of the same old drama. It's already happened. We've already done this. So it can't be that will suffice. Or if it is, it's going to be a new way to think of it. So it's nothing different than what I'm doing. Because
you don't think the original conflict was politically conditioned?
Which one? Of the Cappadocians? Or
of Chalcedon and the schism?
I never think it's sufficient to simply say that's all that was going on, especially given that...
I didn't say all. I asked if it was conditioned at all.
Yeah, of course it was. So was Nicaea. I mean, Constantine was there. So anyone who wants to defend the Nicene Creed is going to... What if someone, like a lot of people actually have said, well, look, Nicaea, the whole reason why you say the Son is consubstantial with the Father is because of Constantinianism and political stuff. Right, and that will shore up the Roman Empire's political stance over and against.
It's true
against the barbarians, right, who are Arian.
That is what happened,
right? But I wouldn't think anyone that confesses.
There was a political aspect, not in every detail, obviously, but there is a political aspect to Nicaea.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like there's a linguistic one, just like there's a social one,
exactly.
Psychological, all that.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
You don't think if we were to, I don't know, hypothetically relitigate Chalcedon today that the result would be different? You think it would be the same result?
Well, insofar as the truth doesn't change and insofar as we're getting at the truth, it shouldn't be totally different. But how we will arrive at that will surely be different and will be circumstantial, sure. Like, for example, like say Karl Rahner writing his really great essay on Chalcedon called Beginning or End, and he basically answers both, which I think anybody that adheres to a living tradition will have to say. He does mention that maybe, in a footnote, maybe some of the stuff Hegel said isn't so different or foreign from what Chalcedon was at least setting up. It's not that they're the same or there's just like no difference. It's that, right, so that would mean that a relitigation of Chalcedon today, for example, wouldn't be able so easily to ignore, say, 19th century German idealism. That's different. That's different, of course. Bulgakov does.
Do you think the Nicene symbol of faith? I'm sorry.
I was going to say, that's actually a great way to understand perhaps Bulgakov and Lamb of God. He's doing that same. I mean, where in Chalcedon or anybody defending Chalcedon will you see them saying, as he does in Lamb of God, that there are three subjects of the Trinity, and that they are a self-positing I, so that the self of the Father posits himself as another I in the Son, etc. Right? This is Fichte. This isn't Chalcedon, right? So I think it's almost inevitable that will happen. It'll be different in that way. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just, I'm not trying to rush you. It's just we're very limited on time, and we're only on page 2 of my 13 pages of questions. So I'm trying to get through the whole book, but if we don't get through the whole thing, it's okay. If you wanted to come back and do a second episode, we could do that. If you don't want to, that's fine. But the next question I want to ask, based on what you've been saying, is: do you believe that the Nicene symbol of faith could be possibly modified, abrogated, superseded, sublated, etc., after its dogmatic declaration at the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD?
Not as a symbol, but what is a symbol?
I mean, the actual words of the creed.
Not at all.
Okay, so let's go through the terminology really quickly in case there's anyone listening to this still that doesn't know. So what is a hypostasis, or person?
Well, a person at the very least is a subject. Right? That is to say, the agent or the actor, the one who suffers, the one who takes any predicate that you could possibly say. That's at least what a person, what a hypostasis is, right? That's even true for like animals or trees, right? And so at the very least, you have to start with an hypostasis as a subject. Now, if you're asking what will it also need to become later in light of later Christological controversies, right? That would be different. But I'll say the baseline idea would be subject, which is why even in Maximus...
What is it for Maximus and what is it for you?
I say for Maximus, a person is, again, first and foremost, a subject who has natures which provide the faculties by which that subject actually exists, either in act or in passivity, right? Suffering.
Is it the same for you?
It's at least that for me, and I think it's at least that for me. Now, there's something more to Maximus's, though. It's not just that. The subject is also, as I say in the book, positive. But I cite, for example, Opusculum 16, where Maximus uses the word, the Greek type or imprints, and he says that the person imprints upon the natural activities his or her own style is the one. There's weird interpretations there, translations. But the idea is that there is no such thing as humanity that actually exists that's not already stamped by the personal identity of any particular one. Like Henry's way of being human and of talking and of living and of thinking isn't just a human way. It's you're giving something to that actual instance of humanity that isn't inherent in the definition of humanity. And yet it's human. It's actually human. And so there's what I call in the book a positivity to person, which I do think is non-negotiable, and I think Maximus holds this as well. So there's something non-formal that your proper name points out. Henry, Paul, John, right? What is it pointing to? What's the reference what's the referent? It's the who, the subject, sure. But it's also like whatever is available through interpersonal knowledge, or as Maximus says, by experience directly. Something you couldn't abstract. I couldn't know you. I couldn't know Henry without meeting you and knowing you personally and interacting with you and watching how you act. I have to watch you unfold. I can't abstract you. And yet I can know what humanity is just from random samples. And so that's another crucial dimension to person, is that person is positive. And what's positive needs a cause. Like it has a reality. It's a fundament, right? So I think that's person. It's not just a subject, like a grammatical subject or a subject in a story that does things and plays a part. It's also contributing metaphysically some content, which is not abstractable because it's not formal. And Maximus is very clear on that, in Ambiguum 17 in particular. So
going back to your method of not simply elaborating Maximus, you're not just doing a summary of Maximus, you're also doing your own work. Is there any difference between Maximus's concept of hypostasis and your own?
Not in the book, no. Mm-mm.
Not in the book. And what about between Maximus and the Nicene Fathers, for example?
Yeah, I think there is some difference. It's a development. The difference, one obvious difference is that for Neo-Chalcedonians, Maximus included, the hypostasis is the only thing that, quote, exists in and for itself, or by itself. Natures never exist, or essence, as ousia, never exist in themselves. they can only subsist, have real concrete existence in and as a hypostasis and the set of all of the hypostases, right?
When you say nature, are you saying physis or ousia?
I'm saying both. They're equivalent already in the.
They're equivalent.
Yeah, in Chalcedon they're already equivalent, but they're definitely equivalent for all.
For Maximus and for you, they're all equivalent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now,
so what is a nature then?
A nature is the entire set. Well, nature, for one thing, is just a kind of being. But what we really mean by that is the entire set of faculties, that is, powers or potencies, which enables a person or hypostasis to act as the kind of being it is. That's what Maximus says, for example, back again in Impostulum 16. So if you are a human being, that's your nature. That means you're physical. You have locomotive properties as an embodied creature, but you're also intellectual. You have actions that are simply, for example, contemplative or theoretical, and you have the combination of them always at the same time. And so when Henry acts, he does so as a human being. It's the potencies within human nature which allow you to do and act in every way that you can. It's the possibility of your kind of acts, the kinds of acts and the kinds of ways you can suffer. But when Henry acts, it's not humanity acting, it's Henry. And Henry's more than just humanity. There's something else about Henry that's not just simply human, in terms of understood as nature. Yeah, but physis, ousia are systematically made synonyms all in Maximus's work and most Neo-Chalcedonians, since they thought that Chalcedon demanded that. Yeah.
Is it possible for there to be a real nature without a hypostasis?
No.
And what is the principle of individuation operative in the incarnation?
Yeah, that's a huge part of chapter 1. The principle is the logos. And this is something that, like, say, mid-20th century French Thomists hated about the Neo-Chalcedonians, because they have a whole system, right, derived from Thomas that says, for example, you, Henry, can't receive grace except in your mode of your being, which is created. And so they have a distinction between, say, uncreated grace and created grace. It's not that there's two different graces. In fact, it's two different modes of the same grace. And so you have to receive grace in the mode of humanity, which is created. It's intellectual. That's why there's gifts of the Spirit that have to do with your mind, etc. So that's like that. They didn't like the fact that, say, Maximus didn't have this idea. And in fact, he only has uncreated grace. He specifies that. He doesn't have an idea of uncreated grace and created grace, because in the incarnation, the operative principle, what makes the flesh of Christ both real and his, is nothing but his own person. Right? In hypostasis is the technical term that they start using. That no nature has a hypostasis of its own. It's always in hypostasis, and Maximus even says that of the Trinity. That means that there is no actual flesh of Christ unless it is him. He himself is giving his own subsistence to it. That's its creation from nothing. His identification with that flesh is the same thing as it's being created out of nothing. And the reason why the Thomists got worried about it was because what it means is that he himself is the only principle of mediation, because he's the only principle of individuation, which is to say the coming together, making it indivisible, right, without division. An individual is that which is a unit without division. So the principle of individuation in the incarnation is nothing less than the Son of God. Not matter, right, as in some schemes, not some particular or individual form, as in some other schemes, but the person, this positivity I said earlier, of the Son himself. And that positivity alone is what allows, as it were, if you're going to speak crudely, the nature's activities to interpenetrate and to be it is the conduit through which those two are even unified at all. And so you don't need something like created grace for Maximus, because the mode of being a person is already more than just simply being created, or uncreated for that matter, as the Son is both. And so since he is both, he allows the two in himself to to mix, to use the sort of a controversial terms, or perichoresis is what he uses, to interpenetrate. And so you don't need something like figuring out how the modes fit together in a created mode versus an uncreated mode. So anyway, that's into other stuff. But yeah, so I would say the principle of individuation can't be anything other than the person himself, right? Or else the incarnation has some other cause than the word.
What does Maximus mean when he says that, quote, in the first anarchic efficient cause of all beings, we do not contemplate the nature and the hypostasis as identical to each other?
So I think what he's saying there is that we don't contemplate them as identical on the level of logic.
What is the first anarchic efficient cause of all beings?
The Trinity.
The Trinity?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's exactly because you don't contemplate the ousia and the hypostases as one and the same, that the very nature, the actual existential character of the first cause is the whole Trinity rather than, say, a monad. Right? So that's the kind of another deep development that's sort of concurrent with these Christological developments. And I'll make this note here methodologically. One thing that does distinguish Neo-Chalcedonians from, say, Miaphysites or even strict Chalcedonians is that they do think that there needs to be some sense of a univocity, to use the later Scotistic idea, a univocity between what you say in the incarnation, the economy, and what you say about the Trinity, theology. It's not because there's a concept that's univocal between, say, God and the world, or creator and creature. It's or the human intellect's reason and right how God is, quote unquote, in himself. But it's because the Son of God is himself the univocal term, not a concept, because he's a person. But that's why the revelation of Christ is the revelation of the Trinity as well. Maximus goes on about this in the exposition on the Lord's Prayer. He calls it a new theology, which is proclaimed by the one who is himself God enfleshed. So, and it's not just that he teaches like some propositions that are new or some abstract principles that are new. It's not that he denies, for example, the law of non-contradiction. That wouldn't be useful or even necessary. It's that he himself shows you by being himself, God human, that God is not simply equivalent to his essence, what we can abstract about divine nature. And he makes the same point as well in Ambiguum 5, I think, about it might not be 5, about Gregory of Nazianzus, who has to make this distinction that in God, right, the ousia and the hypostases are not one and the same when he's contemplating the crucifixion. That's the context. Because you don't want to say the divinity was crucified. That's absurd. So that's why the law of non-contradiction is not gone, because he does still think that's absurd. So then how does it make sense to say God is joined with us in death? Well, it must be that God is more than what you can abstract about divinity, which other theologians had already said negatively, right? Dionysius says this, right? God is a super essence. He's beyond being. He's not even, there is no divine essence really in that sense. That his divine essence is to be more than essence. And what I think is added by the Christological is the specificity or the precision that, yes, exactly, the divine essence is more than an essence exactly because it is three persons who are nevertheless not three gods. That would be the ultimate payoff, but that's getting a little ahead there.
When you say that the first anarchic efficient cause of all beings, and that's just the Trinity,
yeah.
Does that mean that it's the common ousia? Does that mean it's a particular hypostasis? Is it all three hypostases individually? Is it all three hypostases collectively?
Well, it's all three hypostases in whom alone the divine ousia is even real. That's why he uses in hypostases even for the divinity, the ousia. There is no divinity that's not the three. Even like the God the Father alone. And so not really literally father, it's just what you call him because you're a creature and you come from him, and so it's analogous to father, who came before you and brought you to being. The Father alone is not actually fully, right? That's not the fullness of what the anarchic cause actually is like. If it were, then all things weren't created through the Word and perfected by the Spirit, because the Father alone would be sufficient to be the anarchic cause of all beings. Or why would you need the Trinity to participate in all of creation if if only just one of them was sufficient to be the cause, and that's it, right? So this is an important methodological point, though, that I do think maybe is obscure to some people. That if it's inherent as an implication in the Neo-Chalcedonian position that what you come to say of Christ will affect how you think of God, precisely if it's true that that one is God. Christ, I mean. If it were methodologically the case that you could sort of get all your ducks in a row about divinity, and then when Christ does the incarnation thing, that in no way makes you reconceptualize or at least see in a new light or in a fuller way what's true of the divinity. That's just another way of saying, even if furtively, that God didn't really become human and reveal much of anything about God at all, because it was already there and complete and done and over with. You didn't need really much anything more. So I think so inherent in the Neo-Chalcedonian position is the methodological necessity that these two spheres can't be cordoned off, precisely because in him they are made one. They are one. So that's the basis of any kind of univocity, not a concept, but a thinking through a person. So I don't know if that's...
Does Maximus believe that God is composed of parts?
No, but he does use part-whole language pretty often.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to ask, in what way is a person a whole that, say, for example, a genus is a whole? They're different. Mm. They're different. Different logics, once again, of whole and part altogether. So, yeah.
Another place where we kind of come into this issue of language is how can Christ's human and divine natures be both universal and particular?
They couldn't be unless they depended on being a person in order to be at all. So, right, because universal and particular are inherently opposite. They dialectically depend on each other for you to even understand them, right? You can't understand what a particular means unless you know what a universal means, and vice versa. And so, as I would say, on the level of essence, what they essentially are, you can't make them anything be both of them, because that's just as contradictory as saying, right, one and the same subject is eternal and temporal. But I think that the reason why humanity, there's two reasons why I think he wants to say that humanity, Christ's humanity, is both particular and universal. Well, he wants to say it's particular, of course, because if it's not particular, to the credit of both Nestorians and Miaphysites, they want to point this out. If it's not particular, then it's not a hypostasis. It's not an hypostasis that can be pointed out from anything, right?
Speaking about the Miaphysites, a moment ago you were talking about the Neo-Chalcedonians trying to appeal to the Miaphysites.
Yeah.
Why are Nestorianism and Miaphysitism equally problematic? At least in the narration of the first chapter, that was the impression I got, that they were somehow equally problematic.
Yeah, well, there's on the rhetorical level that, for example, you'll find Leontius of Byzantium, he entitles one of his more famous works on opposite kinds of Docetism. And he means both Miaphysites and Nestorians. What he means, of course, is that Nestorians sort of can't come to make themselves believe that Christ's flesh is really God's humanity. So the humanity of God becomes docetic. Now, no Nestorian would say that. It's a rhetorical move. But then on the other hand, Miaphysites can't come to fully accept that. Oh, I think I got that turned around. It's Miaphysites think that, right, they can't fully accept the humanity, the perpetuance or perpetuity of the humanity after the union, right? Which is why they want to say, with Cyril, by the way, they do have some reason, that after the union, you don't speak of two. You can speak of Christ coming out of two natures. From two natures is the language that they would want to use. That's fine. Cyril on the Pact of Union says this too. Out of two natures is fine. He will concede that you can, in some certain way, speak of two natures even after the union, but they don't want to. Miaphysites would say no, right? And what they want to speak of instead is, it's various, but I think the more common thing would be to speak of a human quality or property which persists after the union. So Laertius would say, well, that's just basically you're discetic about the full humanity of Christ, and you want to just leave it with a quality of humanity of Christ after the union. Whereas the Nestorians deny the divinity. They keep pointing out that, for example, God can't be born, which is why you don't call Mary Theotokos, right? That doesn't make sense. That's an inherent contradiction. God doesn't have a mother. God is without beginning. And so they want to keep pointing. God doesn't cry. God isn't weak. God doesn't admit ignorance. None of that stuff. God certainly doesn't suffer and die in God's self. God is life. Why would God die? It doesn't make any sense. And so they want to focus on the humanity. And for Leontius, they therefore become discetic about Christ's divinity. So this is where I really don't think it's a forced move. I guess someone could quibble, but one scholar, like about 70 years ago, proposed that another feature of Neo-Chalcedonian thinking, what makes them different from even just other Chalcedonians, there are other Chalcedonians, not just Neo-Chalcedonians, but one of the ways they do that is they constantly do this kind of, as it were, dialectical move, where Maximus says, for example, in Epistle 13, really clearly, where they want to put these two together and say, I'm going to borrow some terms here. So now here I am discerning where it's me starting and them ending, maybe, or at least or we're converging or something. They want to say both are equally one-sided reasonings about the whole mystery of Christ. And if you go and you can't help but land in one place or the other if you're stuck within the logic of essence or nature or abstraction. Theodoret of Cyrus begins Eranistes with quote unquote, what's he called? There's like a special term there. It's something like eternal rules or something, or like unchangeable principles. And it's stuff that's common sense to us, right? Divinity can't die, right? Divinity is not born because divinity is uncaused, etc., right? And yet they get somewhere further than Nestorius will get. But from the Neo-Chalcedonian perspective, okay, if you begin there with the duality, you will not find a way back to the oneness in any real full sense. You just can't do it. It's self-limiting. But on the other hand, if you begin simply with the oneness, as they think the Miaphysites do, it's an abstract oneness you're beginning with. It's not talking about the actual person. It's talking about being an individual or a real concrete physis. Then you'll never get around to the full duality. And so they constantly sort of want to put them together and say, look, of course they think they're opposites, but really they share more than they want to let on. And then they just oscillate between dialectical poles because that will never resolve. And so the Neo-Chalcedonian wager is to say there is a deeper logic at work, and we've not properly understood the difference, not just the difference between hypostasis and ousia, but then the way in which an actual person is both at once. And that's something I do want to say. I have never claimed that a principle of hypostasis is the answer to all questions. If I said that, I would be making hypostasis a genus, which is exactly what I'm denying of it, right, on one side. Nor have I ever said that Christ is so completely unique that he's unique as an exception and as a contrary. And this is where it might differ, for example, from the early Bart. Because if you just say, well, Christ's uniqueness consists in the fact that he opposes everything else in the world, and he smashes against everything on a dialectical move, right? And there is you can't learn anything from any philosophy or anything like that, which even the later Bart sort of makes fun of himself on. We have to say, you actually have made the uniqueness of Christ totally comprehensible. There's nothing incomprehensible about an exception, because an exception is just, we always say, right? Exception proves the what? The rule. So if you know what a rule is, you also already know what an exception is, and they're both abstract. And so this is the Neo-Chalcedonian point. Christ is neither, and he is both because he is neither. It's exactly because he's not, you might say it this way a little more clearly. It's exactly because he isn't in his wholeness. That's why I said the whole mystery of Christ, and one reason why. He can't it's exactly because he isn't reducible to either universal or particular that he can be the actual unity in his person, not in an abstract principle. He can be the actual unity of both. That is to say, the generation of the very dialectic of difference in himself. And that's a wild, mind-bending kind of thing to say. But the Neo-Chalcedonians don't see any other way forward between the Miaphysite and the Nestorian dialectical back and forth that has any other way out. They think that's just basically it's a closed system. It won't resolve. It'll just fight forever. So we got to go deeper. Hence the developments, etc., right, and so forth. So, yeah.
So what do you mean when you say that Christ's hypostasis identifies his, quote, two incommensurable natures?
On the level of nature, divinity and humanity are incommensurable. Now, there is a self sort of defeating aspect to this, and I would admit that. That's a more idealist point where you could say, well, you're saying they're both natures, right? So apparently they have something in common. I think that's an interesting way to actually do an immanent critique of that whole way, right? Or it's like saying, for example, well, God's ousia is really above all ousia.
I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know how anything could identify two things which are, by definition, incommensurable.
Unless they're not reducible to a definition abstractly, right? Like soul and body are by definition incommensurable. Well, they're not really totally incommensurable, but they're contrary. The essence of a soul and essence of a body, they're not the same.
You wouldn't say that the soul is the form of the body?
Well, why would you have to say the soul is the form of the body if the body simply is the soul already? So you're making a point, right? You're saying soul is formal, matter is not. So they're different. Now they might have a relation.
Yeah, but I'm not identifying the soul as the body. I'm not saying the soul and the body. Well,
right.
Okay. I'm not being interviewed. I'm not trying to take the space away from you to talk. I'm just saying, like, for me, it seems a little bit strange to say that we're going to identify two things which are by definition, like, you can't identify them.
No, what I'm saying is you
can't say there are two things which are by definition that can't be one, right? Or you can't, like, another thing that I don't really understand is how could the Son, who is very God, become one with human nature?
Yeah, so
like, what does that mean that he becomes one with human nature? Does he pre-exist only in his divinity, and then at some point he becomes, like, that doesn't, we can't say that God becomes anything.
Well, we have to say with John 1 that the Word became flesh. So we do have to say that. Now the question is, what does it mean? So we have to say it. It's always the question is, what does it mean? And if the Word didn't become flesh, then I don't know where an incarnation is. Why are we even talking about it, right? So now I totally agree, however, that become can't simply mean what we normally mean when we say become. That I agree with, right? It's that you become a day older tomorrow is not the same thing as the Word becoming flesh. I agree. So, but that's my point. Now we're introducing a new way that we mean become, which abstracted from the event of the incarnation wasn't necessary. Why do I even have to think about a new way of becoming apart from the fact that God became human? That's what made me think of it. Right?
But I mean, God's incarnation, there's nothing that's affecting God whatsoever. God is perfectly impassible.
Right, and there's two ways to run that. Either that's because the incarnation isn't really an incarnation of God, because God can't become, and yet incarnation is a becoming. Or something about God is always already becoming. That is to say, our eternal incarnation. That's the way some Miaphysites even go that way, like later on, Arabic Miaphysites. So I guess the question, I mean, like, look, we can't not say the Word of God became flesh and dwelt among us. That's Scripture. You have to.
You just equivocate what God means.
If we equivocate, then we're not saying anything, and the claim of the incarnation is superfluous. What's the point of saying it, right?
What do you mean? The Word of God was made flesh. Just like we say that Mary is the mother of God, insofar as she bore she was the mother of the flesh of, the incarnate Word. We don't say that she's the mother of the Father.
Well, then, but that's Nestorius' point. His point was, right, we don't say.
But the response is to say, look, Nestorius, it's fine to say the mother of God. We simply say insofar as blah, 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 blah. Look, no problem.
Well, actually, he did end up saying that. He says, insofar as we qualify it in such a way that it doesn't really literally mean mother, then we can, in some catachrestic way,
No, it literally does mean mother, right? The issue is that he wanted to say mother of Christ and not mother of God.
Right.
But she really is the mother of God insofar as she bore the incarnate word of God, who is God of God.
Yeah, but
We don't say that
right.
Jesus just is God when we talk about the Father. When we're referring to the Father, we say he's God of God.
No.
Father just is God. Jesus is God of God, right? The Spirit is consubstantial with the Father. So,
no, I mean, Jesus is also true God of true God. And if it's the case,
true God of true God.
sure. So that means God can be of God. That doesn't see. There's two options here. It's not just one. It's if God is of God, true God of true God, light from light. Either that means that the second God, or the reference or the word, is somehow qualified in a way that the first wasn't, or it means that the first can do something you didn't think that it could do, namely become of God. Those are the two options there. There isn't just one. If we only think in a sequence, we will never realize that you have to rethink something that came earlier in the sequence. We'll assume that. But
don't you have to think in a sequence in order to do it at all? Like, how am I supposed to just articulate?
No, I agree. I actually think, and actually that's the way I would characterize what you might call any propedeutic to the gospel. I would always say you have to begin there. I agree. Like, you have to begin in philosophy. You have to know this stuff, right? You have to have metaphysical distinctions and all that. You can't even perceive the marvel in the incarnation if you haven't understood what it means to speak of divine simplicity. I agree.
Okay.
But it's different to say, because we have to start here, we can never revisit where we started. And saying,
what does it mean to revisit?
It means that the God who we thought only was God and Father of the whole world also has a Son, and we didn't know that, and that Son is true God just as much as the first one was true God. That wasn't clear before.
You don't think that someone can know that God has a word without, like, prior to the incarnation?
No, I think they can know that it's a word, but will they say, like Philo did, that it's a second God? Will they say, like the Middle Platonists, like Ammonius in the 3rd century, that, well, yeah, it's a divine, it's godly? Will they say, like Arius, that, well, sure, it's the highest creature and creator, like it's a mix, which is why he's the bridge, but he's not the same God. It's not the equally God as the Father, right? So you can talk about a word, but you have not talked about the consubstantial word with the Father. But surely, this is my point. I think if we abstractly say, well, since I have to think in a sequence, the sequence must go this way always, that's one-sided. Because the other possibility is, well, we have to think in a sequence. Yes, of course, you got to start somewhere and you got to go somewhere. But I will not ahead of time say that the whole truth of the sequence can't involve the reconceptualization of moments earlier in the sequence. How would I know that until I got there at the end?
I mean, that's what Nyssa does when he says that the Trinity is the Spirit, the Son, and God. He reverses the sequence.
Right, exactly. And what we talked about before, like St. Simeon, right, would say, yeah, and there's another way in which actually the Son is prior to the Father. Because
if what you mean, right, unless you properly qualify the causation, so if you're sloppy with your causation.
Yeah, and actually this is where that's my whole point. My whole point is that that you do, so I would say this, you have to begin with, say, the interiority of the Father. It is the case that the Greek fathers called the Father on occasion the cause of the Son. It just is idea, right? In the essay, I wrote an essay on Bonaventure's ideas of all this, of the Father's kenosis and all that, and I cite some Greek fathers. I think he's actually similar to them on this. Whereas St. Thomas Aquinas doesn't allow any talk of causality or hierarchy in the Trinity. So they differ on that. So you have to begin there. But then the question is, how is the Father cause of the Son? Is it the?
Well, he's the arche anarchos,
right? But
he's the principle without principle.
But he's also the principle without principle of creation. So does it mean the Son is a?
So that's the Son. The Son is the principle of creation, and he has his principle, the principle without principle.
Right, but lots of different people had that. None of them wanted to say consubstantial. Right, because because if he's the principle of the principle, in other words, I'll say it this way.
I mean, Nyssa says consubstantial and that he's the principle of the principle.
No, I know. I know. What I'm saying is that's a development. That's a Christian development. I agree. They say that.
Mhm.
But there are tons of other people that knew of a word of the Father, and they would not want to. In fact, they would resist it. In fact, they would say it's nonsensical to say that the Word who is qualified in a way that the Father isn't, that somehow they're the same essence. If it's qualified differently, it means it's a different definition. Right? That's all, because a definition is species plus differentia, difference. That's the only way you define anything, right? Is you make a difference from other things. And that's how you categorize things and define them. De finis, right? From the edges, from the boundaries. So if you add a difference to a being that makes it differ almost as it were, in principle, from another being, you've just simply said it's a different kind of being, right? That's Eunomius's argument. So when
And Nissa says if he's talking about the Father, then we agree with him. He's Orthodox.
Right, but what he's doing, but really what Eunomius is doing is saying the Father is divinity. That's the definition, and there's nothing.
Well, that would be a mistake because for Nissa, if I'm correct, for Nissa, the one God is identified as the hypostasis of the Father.
Right, but what he means by Father is that the Father has a consubstantial Son, so that the Father's actual oneness isn't actually distinct from the Son and the Spirit, right? And so the entirety of the Trinity is also the one God because they have no other essence except the Father's, right?
Of course, they get it from the Father.
So that means God is no longer defined by being simply unoriginate, because if that were true, then the second two persons are excluded.
Of course not.
Right. So now God,
that wouldn't make any sense.
Right. So now God is not a definition.
So we're running low on time. We have a lot of questions we could ask. Do you believe that God is passible?
What do you mean by God?
There we go.
I think that the divine nature is not passible. It's not passible. It's impassible.
Do you believe that God is atemporal?
The divine nature is, yes.
No, but do you think the Father is atemporal?
Yeah, by nature, right? Yeah.
No, but I mean in any sense. Is he temporal in any sense?
Insofar as he is wholly in the Son, who is incarnate and therefore temporal as well as atemporal, sure.
Do you think the Word is temporal?
Has to be. Was the Word there during the days of Moses, like as Jesus Christ? Right. So there is Eriugenes says this in Book 3 of Perifusion. He says this of the primordial causes. He says we have to say both that there was never a time that they were not, and there was a time that they were not. And he says because the Word Himself is that. So I think he's being a good reader of Maximus there.
Do you believe that Christ pre-existed in his divinity?
Yeah, and in Maximus's letter 15, he says at one point the before of Christ, the pre, you might say, of existence, is just his divinity. That's what it is. And the after is his humanity, which by nature has a before and after structure, right? Logic. And so,
do you believe there are true contradictions?
Yeah, of course. Any abstract contrary that is said abstractly to be the one and the same is a contradiction.
How can human persons make God a suffering God-man?
Human persons can?
This is a quote from your book. How can, quote, human persons make God a suffering God-man?
Oh, from chapter 4. Well, because Maximus says that the passion of Christ, his suffering, Cyril's life-giving sufferings, is not only, he calls it the judgment, and I try to unfold, I'm not going to get all the details here, but unfold what he means by that, specifically in the Origins tradition. There's a pretty highly important sense of that. But what he means, I think, in different language is this, that the suffering, if Christ's humanity is particular and universal, then his suffering as human would be both too. And the universality of suffering, human suffering, means all the suffering of all human beings. Right? It wouldn't mean anything else if it's human suffering we're talking about. And if it's human suffering that Christ unites himself with, just as it's human death that Christ unites himself with, then, as Maximus says in I think it's the Mystagogy, he says that Christ suffers mystically in all of those in proportion to the amount of suffering that they suffer. And it's not, though, just so that, oh, cool, we have someone to suffer with. Sergius Bulgakov also talks about the co-suffering of Christ with all people. But it's because it's in being united, even in our dire, conditions of mortality, finitude, deception, stupidity, illness, failure, fall. It's exactly because he unites himself in all of that. And that's not abstract, right? This is actually an important point, I think. Christ doesn't have to overcome death abstractly, because there is no such thing as an abstract death. He has to overcome the death of people. Dead persons are the problem, right? And so he has to unite himself with the entire suffering of actually suffering and dead people in order to raise and to get them through and to resurrect actually suffering and dead people and make them actual resurrected people, right? And so so the way then it makes sense to say that human, I don't remember how the phrase went, but the human persons make
God a suffering God-man.
Yeah. That means that he's reacting not abstractly to the human plight, because there is no abstract human plight. He's reacting to the very concrete, total, determinate sufferings of all humans in all time and places. And he's taking that into himself, uniting himself to that, and therefore uniting his own divinity, which he still bears, to all of that, even to times prior to his historical birth. And that is the seed of salvation in all of creation from the very foundation of creation, right? The lamb slaughtered since before the foundation of the world. So I would say in that sense, the suffering God is not just it's not just like a cool idea God had in response to the fall. It is the most determinate, exact reaction, so to speak. Reaction is not the right word, but something like a reaction to fallen human beings. Yeah.
And what does unchanging becoming mean?
Well, it doesn't mean anything abstractly, because that would be a contradiction. Unchanging becoming would mean the one who can both be by nature unchanging and who also by nature becomes, and somehow makes them perichoretically or whatever united or interpenetrated in such a way that even you, who are a temporal, changing, becoming creature, can somehow become, as he says, without beginning. Right? So it means nothing abstractly except nonsense. But in actual persons, first and foremost, the whole person of Christ, it means his two natures. Right?
Mm. There's a lot of questions that I would like to ask you. We're really running to the end. I'm going to end with these two questions. And if you would like to come back later, I'm happy to wait on the episode and record more and then stitch it together and make a part 2. But I want to ask these two final questions, and then I'll let you go because we don't have infinite time. The first question I would like to ask is very broad. Jordan, do you reject classical theism?
No, I don't reject it. I think it needs to but I also don't think it's not sufficient for the whole mystery of Christ.
Mm-hmm. And what do you make of David Bentley Hart's critique of your work?
Well, what I think of it is that it needs, we need to maybe discuss exactly what the criticisms are at more length.
About the whole theogonic, mythology stuff, the THM.
Yeah, well, it's fine if you're talking about Moltmann, or if you're talking about certain Bardians, or if you're talking about Whitehead, or if you're talking about someone like that. I just don't think that any of those represent what I think. So, it couldn't be that I think God simply becomes God. One, because I think there's no such thing as an abstract God, which is what's providing the condition there for the absurdity, right? God can't become. That's a general abstract principle that we all agree on. Therefore, if you say God becomes God abstractly, that's just a contradiction. It's easy to point those out. Those are just definitions of words. But look, I also don't accept, though, and I'm not saying David thinks this, so I'm not making a retort per se, but I think perhaps to clarify my own position, I also don't think it's wrong that many different thinkers, both within the Christian tradition and outside of it, have also looked at, say, the doctrine of the incarnation and said, on the surface, when I'm thinking about this just abstractly, it does kind of seem absurd. Like, I don't think they're irrational for thinking that.
Why would the doctrine of the incarnation be absurd?
Because God can't be born. God can't grow up. God can't have a mother and father. God can't suffer. God can't die. God can't be passible. And so right? So who is this person that's doing all that, right? Is he God?
The God-man.
Right. But how is he God? Isn't that equivocal? Right?
He's the Word of God.
Yeah, but what does of God mean, right? If it just means
he's fully divine.
Okay, so fully divine would include not being passible. So how can he be both?
Well, he's passible according to his human nature.
Right, it's his human nature though, and he is the one who suffers. It's not his human nature, that's the medium.
But the divine nature doesn't suffer.
Right, exactly. Natures actually don't do anything abstractly. But the one who can be both by nature, that's not immediately clear to, I think, a lot of people. I mean, most of the Christological controversies, unless we want to reduce them simply to political machinations, which I don't, they would make no sense if there was no initial scandal. I don't make irrationality into an absolute virtue, but I also don't think mere rationalism says much. Because
what do you think rationalism is?
Well, that's my point. It doesn't say much of anything. It depends on who's saying it, who's claiming it, or who's critiquing it. Rationalism would just be, right, those who think that all truth can and should be perceived by reason. Okay, I mean, like, almost no one disagrees.
What else is it perceived by if not by reason?
Exactly, but what is reason? That's the more interesting question.
The Lord Jesus Christ himself. I mean, are you talking about the faculty of reason in a kind of in post-enlightenment sense, or reason itself? That'd be the divine logos.
Right, exactly. But then I also wouldn't call, like, Theodoret of Cyrus a post-enlightenment rationalist, and yet he's making arguments based on what, by reason, we know, right, of God, that he can't, for example, die. I don't think you have to be post-enlightenment to think that. He thinks that's just an obvious truth of reason. And so my point isn't that there is no resolution. That isn't what I think. But what I also think is the resolution will have to be going beyond what we even mean exactly by, quote unquote, something is or isn't reasonable, right?
What does it mean to go beyond that?
Exactly. That's the question. It doesn't mean anything abstractly. What it means is, for example, paying attention to, well, what is the difference between a person and the natures which are generating these contradictions and these problems and pressures? Why is it that you yourself can both be somehow physical or visible, but also some invisible? Aren't those words necessarily contradictory if you try to say one and the same thing is visible and invisible? Well, you'd say, no, it's my soul that's visible or something, right? Or the form of the body is invisible because it's only visible by means of the body. That's Aristotle. But fine. But there is also one subject who is both. And how is the one subject both? That's the interesting. I don't think that's actually inaccessible. And I also don't think it's beyond reason, because I would want to expand our sense of reason to also what we experience every single day, including your own self-consciousness. You know that you're both, and yet you're not one. You're not both in some way that's just like equating the two abstractly. Obviously, visible and invisible are different. But you yourself have already, just by your life, like who you are, your person, your spirit, you might say, concrete spirit, is already the overcoming of these two opposites. And so, anyway, that's an example of saying, I don't think we get very far by simply saying, we can say that reason, everything, there is no truth that's not perceptible by reason. But of course, the question will become, what does it mean, though, to say with Christianity and other religions and other philosophies, not only that the logos, the reason is a person, but that the logos is a God-man who actually was born in history and suffered and died and rose again. Does that do anything to our idea of what reason is and is capable of, and how we perceive it, and how we get to it, and how it's accessible? It doesn't. So the death of Logos on the cross does nothing to how we understand Logos in ourselves. Reason isn't abstract. Reason ultimately is the person of Christ. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I. Who is the I? Who is the I? Reason
The Lord Jesus
exactly.
Christ.
Reason doesn't talk to itself or about itself unless it's a person. So reason is a subject, right? Is whatever we mean by person. That's what reason is.
You wouldn't accept hypostasis as entity?
No, that's way too vague. Everybody accepted that. That's actually a condition of the debate, right? Because Nestorius says, look, if you think that Christ,
or subsistence, if you don't like entity.
I don't like that. I mean, I would accept
It's too vague.
Right. I mean, it's at least that. That's what I would say.
You want to be more specific. I mean, I think I know we're drawing to a close. I don't mean to cut you off, but we don't have infinite time. You have your life to live. I wish I could ask you all 13 pages of my questions. But what are you working on next?
Well, I've got two things. Well, okay, three things. And this is what I'm doing when I'm not, spending most of my time with my four daughters. I am a part of a team that got a grant to translate Schelling's late lectures on the philosophy of revelation. So we're in the midst of doing that. Very interesting, very difficult text. I feel like my book is like a child's book compared to these lectures. So that is one thing I'm working on, translation of that, and then working on translations. I mentioned of Maximus's letters, which I think are important. 9 of his most substantial Christological letters are in that collection. They're not translated into English. Yeah.
I want to thank you again for being here and express my sincere gratitude for your work and your friendship. I think it's obvious to everyone, even those of us who disagree with you, that what you're doing is very important. And if only we had more Jordan Woods, if only we had more people